wind had a name in the Arizona Territory that year. It was not a name whispered by the settlers who cursed it, but one felt in the bones, a dry, feverish breath that came off the Sonoran expanse and scoured the town of San Miguel. It carried the red dust of the Mule Mountains, a fine grit that worked its way into everything, into the floorboards of the schoolhouse, the pages of the books, and the lines around Eliza Hart's eyes. From the window of her small classroom, she watched the dust devils spin across the hardpan, dancing like thin, angry ghosts. She was a widow, a teacher, a woman alone in a place that had little room for such things. Her husband, Samuel, had been taken not by a bullet or a thrown horse, but by the same fever for gold that had orphaned her as a girl. It was a quieter death, but it left a silence just as vast. Now, her life was measured by the scratching of slate pencils and the halting recitation of sums, a small bastion of order against the heat and the dust and the ever-present threat of chaos that simmered just beyond the town's edge. San Miguel was a splinter of a town, all raw timber and false fronts, squeezed between the furnace of the desert and the anvil of the mountains. It was a place of last chances and desperate ventures, where justice was often a matter of who held the heavier gun or the longer rope. Eliza held to her own ideals, quiet things she had inherited from her father, a preacher who believed in the inherent goodness of man, a belief that had not survived his journey west. She believed in fairness, in the simple, unassailable truth of right and wrong, but she was a woman, and her voice was a small thing, easily lost in the hot wind. A lone crow circled high above, a black speck against the bleached blue canvas of the sky. Its shadow drifted over the dusty street, a fleeting omen. She often saw it, a silent watcher, and she wondered what it saw from its vantage, what secrets the vast, shimmering land held. The slow afternoon was shattered by the thunder of hooves and a chorus of panicked shouts. Eliza moved to the doorway, her hand shielding her eyes against the glare. A knot of riders was galloping into town, their faces grim, their horses lathered and heaving. At their lead was Jed Rourke, a man who wore his authority like his fine leather coat, both too heavy for the climate. He was an agent for the railroad, a bringer of progress, he called it, but everyone knew his true business was land. He acquired it by any means necessary, his progress leaving a trail of broken treaties and displaced families, both settler and native. Beside him rode Sheriff Greeley, a man whose ambition had long ago curdled into lazy corruption. His gut strained the buttons of his vest, and his face was perpetually flushed, not from the sun, but from the whiskey he favored at the saloon. They reined in before the sheriff's office, the center of a quickly growing crowd. Rourke dismounted with a flourish, his spurs jingling. He held up a hand for silence, a gesture of practiced command. He spoke of an attack, his voice ringing with manufactured outrage. A freight wagon, one of his, carrying essential supplies, had been ambushed in the canyon pass. Savages. He spat the word. An Apache war party. He described the scene with lurid detail. The driver and guard dead. The wagon looted and burned. The crowd murmured, the sound like dry leaves skittering. Fear, sharp and metallic, scented the air. Men reached for the pistols on their hips, their eyes turning instinctively toward the hazy mountains, the ancestral home of the Chiricahua. Sheriff Greeley nodded along, his expression one of solemn gravity, though his eyes were empty. He declared the formation of a voluntary guard, a posse to ensure the safety of the town. It was a familiar ritual, one that Eliza had seen before, a pretext. Rourke's band of hired thugs and local bullies would ride out, not for justice, but to further his claims, to push another family off their homestead or encroach further onto protected lands. Later, after the children had been dismissed to the worried custody of their parents, Eliza felt the walls of the small schoolhouse closing in. The air was thick with tension. She needed to walk, to breathe air that was not choked with fear and lies. Her feet took her along a familiar path that led away from the town, toward the low foothills where the saguaros stood like silent sentinels. It was a path she took to clear her head, to feel the immensity of the land and the smallness of her own troubles. The path curved near the entrance to the very canyon pass Rourke had spoken of. Curiosity, a dangerous and persistent trait of hers, pulled her from the trail. She told herself she only wanted to see, to understand. The smell of burnt wood and something else, something coppery and grim, hung in the still air. The scene was much as Rourke had described it, yet wrong in subtle, screaming ways. The wagon was a skeleton of charred timbers, arrows, fletched in the Chiricahua style, bristled from its sides, but they looked too neat, too deliberately placed, like pins in a cushion. Her husband had traded with the Apache, had known them as men, not monsters. He had told her of their ways in battle, the fierce, swift economy of their movements. This felt staged. She moved closer, her gaze sweeping the ground, and then she saw them. The boot prints, not the soft, smooth impression of a moccasin, but the deep, sharp-edged print of a cowboy boot, with a clear, stacked heel. There were dozens of them, churning the sandy soil around the wagon, then glinting in the low sun. She saw the brass, small, metallic cylinders scattered in the dust. She bent and picked one up. It was a .44 caliber Henry casing. She knew it well. Samuel had owned such a rifle. It was the weapon of the white man, of soldiers and settlers. The Apache fought with older weapons, with bows and lances and the occasional government-issue rifle taken in a raid, its ammunition precious and sparingly used. They would not have littered the ground with spent cartridges. The pieces clicked into place in her mind, forming a picture of cold, calculated deceit. This was not a raid. It was a murder, dressed up to look like one. A performance for the benefit of San Miguel, designed to stoke the flames of hatred and fear, flames that would allow Jed Rourke to burn his way to whatever he desired. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to tell someone. The truth had to be known. Justice, the ideal she clung to so fiercely, demanded it. Clutching the brass casing in her hand, she turned and ran back toward the town, the hot wind at her back seeming to push her forward, to whisper warnings she refused to hear. She found Sheriff Greeley at the saloon, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. Rourke was there too, surrounded by the men of his newly formed guard. Eliza did not hesitate. She walked directly to the sheriff, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. She told him what she had seen, the prints, the shell casings. She held out the small piece of brass as proof. Greeley squinted at it. His focus slowed a shift from his drink. He made no move to take it. He grunted, a dismissive, piggish sound. He told her she was a hysterical woman, seeing things that were not there. He said her grief had addled her mind. It was Rourke who stepped forward, a predatory smile playing on his lips. He took the casing from her palm, his fingers brushing hers with a cold intimacy that made her skin crawl. He examined it theatrically, then tossed it onto the bar, where it landed with a soft clink. He spoke to the room, his voice dripping with condescending pity. Mistress Hart, he said, was a known sympathizer. She read books to the native children, tried to teach them white ways they could never understand. Perhaps, he suggested, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. She knew more about this attack than she was letting on. Perhaps her Apache friends had told her their plans. The mood in the saloon shifted instantly. Suspicion, ugly and immediate, turned on her. The faces that had been merely curious were now hostile. Men who had tipped their hats to her that morning now looked at her as if she were a snake. She was no longer Eliza Hart, the town teacher. She was an outsider, a traitor, an accomplice to murder. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but her words were swallowed by a rising tide of angry muttering. Greeley waved a dismissive hand, telling her to go home, to stop spreading wicked lies before she got herself into real trouble. He turned his back on her, a final, clear statement. The matter was closed. She backed away, the hostile stares following her out into the dusty street. She had sought to bring the light of truth and had been cast into shadow. Her own idealism had become a weapon turned against her. The conflict was no longer about a distant sense of justice. It was about her own survival. She could retreat into silence, let the lie stand, and perhaps find a way to continue her quiet life, or she could hold to the truth, a truth that now had the power to destroy her. The next morning, the summons came. The town council, a grim-faced assembly of the blacksmith, the general store owner, and two ranchers whose lands bordered Rourke's intended railway path, were waiting for her in the sheriff's office. Rourke was there, of course, standing by the window, looking for all the world like a concerned citizen. The proceedings were short. Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, a man whose children she had taught to read, cleared his throat and spoke of the town's welfare. He said a teacher held a position of trust. He said her outlandish claims had upset the community, had sown discord at a dangerous time. He spoke of protecting the children from radical ideas, from sympathy for savages. Eliza stood before them, her hands clasped tightly together, and listened as they dismantled her life. She saw the fear in their eyes, the fear of Rourke, of his money, of his power. They were not evil men, but they were weak, and their weakness was a tool in Rourke's hands. The decision was unanimous. Her contract as the town teacher was terminated, effective immediately. They deemed her an unfit influence. She was to vacate the schoolhouse by sundown. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply nodded, turned, and walked out, her back straight, her head held high. She walked through the town that had turned its back on her, the hot wind blowing dust into her face like a final, stinging slap. Back in the empty classroom, the silence was absolute. The small slates were wiped clean, the benches were straight. The air still held the faint, chalky smell of yesterday's lessons. She looked out the window. The sky was a searing, empty blue. The crow was nowhere to be seen. The wind rattled the window pane, a prophecy of the storm to come, a storm not of rain, but of violence and lies. And she was standing directly in its path. There was no dignity in the departure. Eliza paid the liveryman, a stooped old man named Silas with watery eyes and a nervous twitch, for a rickety buckboard and a horse that looked as tired as the land itself. She loaded her single carpet bag, the box of her father's books, and the small remainder of her dignity onto the weathered planks. The people of San Miguel watched from the shadowed doorways of their shops and homes. No one waved. No one wished her well. Their silence was a judgment, a wall she could feel at her back as the buckboard rattled out of town, heading east toward the hazy outline of the Dragoon Mountains. Her destination was the homestead her parents had carved from the dust, and which the dust had reclaimed after the fever took them. It was a place of ghosts and memories. But it was hers. It was the only place left. As the miles stretched out, the heat intensified, pressing down from a white-hot sky. The slow creak of the wheels and the plodding gait of the horse were the only sounds in a vast, sleeping world. She was alone, a pariah cast out. Yet a strange sense of freedom began to settle in her. Out here, there were no accusing eyes, no whispers. There was only the land, honest in its harshness, and the truth, a hard kernel of certainty in her gut. She would not let Rourke's lie stand. She did not know how, but the conviction to prove him a murderer and a thief was the only thing that gave her journey purpose. The trail narrowed as it entered the foothills, winding through canyons of red rock and thorny scrub. In the late afternoon, with the sun beginning its slow descent, a sharp crack echoed through the canyon, followed by the splintering of wood. The buckboard lurched violently, throwing Eliza against the side. The horse stumbled, and the world tilted at a sickening angle. One of the rear wheels had shattered. Its spokes splayed out like broken bones. The axle, unable to bear the weight, had snapped clean in two. Silas climbed down, his face a mask of weary resignation. He kicked the broken wheel, a gesture of pure futility. He looked at Eliza, his expression devoid of sympathy. The wagon was ruined. He declared. He was unhitching his horse. He would ride back to town and, he promised, send help. Eliza looked into his shifty eyes and knew it was a lie. No one would be coming for the town sympathizer. He was cutting his losses, abandoning her and his broken wagon to the wilderness. She watched him ride away, his figure shrinking against the immense backdrop of the canyon until he was gone, leaving a profound and terrifying silence in his wake. The sun touched the western rim of the canyon, painting the rock faces in shades of orange and blood red. The air began to change. The steady, hot breath of the wind grew fitful, coming in sharp. Violent gusts that kicked up sand and whistled through the rocks. The sky in the east was no longer blue, but a bruised, yellowish gray. A storm was coming. Not a rainstorm, which would have been a blessing, but a sandstorm. A maelstrom of dust that could strip flesh from bone. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She huddled behind the useless bulk of the buckboard, pulling her shawl over her head. The wind rose to a shriek, and the world dissolved into a churning, blinding cloud of red grit. The sand stung her exposed skin, worked its way into her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. The noise was a physical force, a deafening roar that vibrated through the ground. She was being buried alive, scoured from the face of the earth. Through the maelstrom, a figure appeared. It was not a sudden arrival, but a slow materialization, as if the storm itself had coalesced into the shape of a man. He was tall and lean, his body possessed of a stillness that seemed to defy the chaos around him. His black hair was held back by a simple cloth band. His skin was the color of the red earth, his features sharp, high cheekbones and a strong jaw. He moved with a liquid grace, his moccasined feet making no sound. It was an Apache. Eliza's first instinct was fear. Her hand fumbled in her bag for the small pistol Samuel had given her, a weapon she had never fired. She was the woman they accused of collusion. Yet, in this moment, all the ingrained fears of her upbringing rose in a suffocating wave. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes taking in the scene, the broken wagon, her terrified figure. He seemed to be looking not just at her, but through her, weighing something she could not comprehend. He made no threatening move. He simply watched as the wind tore at her. Then he spoke. His voice was low, almost lost in the howl of the storm, but it cut through the noise with an unexpected clarity. He spoke in English, the words deliberate and spare. "You will die here." He gestured with his chin, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, toward a fissure in the canyon wall she had not noticed. "Follow." The command was not a request. It was a statement of fact, as simple and undeniable as the storm itself. Her fear warred with the primal instinct to live. To stay was certain death. To follow this man into the unknown was a gamble. She looked from his impassive face to the swirling vortex of sand and made her choice. Clutching her bag, she stumbled after him. He led her not far, to a deep overhang of rock that formed a shallow cave, sheltered from the main force of the wind. Inside, the roar was muted to a low moan. The air was still thick with dust, but it was breathable. He knelt by the back wall of the cave, and with his bare hands, he began to scrape away the sand at its base. After a moment, a patch of dark, damp earth was revealed. He pressed his hand against it, then looked at her. "Water," he said. He pulled a water skin from his shoulder, a beautifully crafted thing of tanned leather, and offered it to her. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. The water was cool and clean, the most precious thing she had ever tasted. It washed the grit from her throat and seemed to bring her back to herself. She handed it back, murmuring her thanks. He took a short drink himself before securing the stopper. For a long time, they sat in silence as the storm raged outside. The suspicion in her mind had not vanished, but it had been pushed aside by a grudging respect. He had saved her life. Still, she could not stop the questions. Was he one of the warriors who had supposedly attacked Rourke's wagon? Was his kindness a trick? "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice raspy. He looked at her, his gaze steady. He was called Crow Runner. Nantan. The name resonated. The crow circling over San Miguel. A watcher. A scout. She told him her name. Eliza. He gave a slow nod of acknowledgement. He seemed to have no interest in conversation. His attention was on the world outside their small shelter, his senses attuned to the shifting voice of the wind. Eliza watched him, the way he sat, perfectly still, conserving his energy. There were old scars on his arms, pale lines against his dark skin. This was a man who knew hardship, who knew violence, but there was no cruelty in his face, only a profound and weary patience. Her eyes drifted to the rock wall beside her. In the dim light, she could make out a series of carvings, faint but clear. The figures of men and animals, of suns and spirals. They were ancient, etched into the stone by 100 generations of hands. They were stories. He saw her looking. "The people," he said softly. "They are the stories. They show the way to water, the way to shelter, the way to live." As the hours passed, a strange sense of peace settled over Eliza. In this small, protected space, the complexities of San Miguel, the lies and the accusations, seemed very far away. There was only the storm, the rock, the shared silence, and the quiet presence of the man who had saved her. Trust was not a decision she made, but something that grew quietly in the darkness, a fragile seed planted by a simple act of kindness, an offering of water. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind died down, and a profound silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the trickling of sand from the rock ledges. The world outside was transformed, scoured clean, the landscape smoothed and softened under a fresh blanket of red dust. The air was cool and sharp. He rose. "We go," he said. "More water. A safe place." She followed him out of the shelter. The rising sun cast long, sharp shadows across the canyon floor. He moved with an easy, tireless stride, and she had to struggle to keep up. He led her not along the main floor of the canyon, but up a narrow, hidden trail that wound its way through the rocks. After perhaps an hour, they came to a small, hidden oasis. A grove of cottonwoods clustered around a deep pool of clear, spring-fed water. It was a place of impossible beauty and life in the midst of the harsh, dry land. As she knelt to drink from the pool, he stood watch, his eyes scanning the surrounding rocks. When she rose, he pointed with his chin toward the edge of the spring, near a cluster of reeds. "Look." She walked over. Half buried in the damp earth was a metal object. It was a large, steel-jawed trap, the kind used by fur trappers. It was rusted, but the spring was still powerful, the teeth still sharp. It had been carefully concealed, placed where an animal, or a person, coming to drink would step right into it. "This is not the work of the Apache," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of a long and bitter history. "This is the mark of the white man. They leave these by our water, to injure our people, to foul the springs. They do this, then say it was us, to give them a reason for war." Eliza stared at the cruel metal jaws. It was another piece of the puzzle, another lie made real. The fake raid, the boot prints, the Henry casings. And now this. It was a calculated campaign of terror, designed to turn everyone against the Apache, to justify driving them from their land, to justify the railroad, to justify Rourke. Her last shred of suspicion toward the man beside her dissolved. He was not her enemy. He was fighting the same lie she was. From the other side of a divide she was only just beginning to understand. He had not just saved her from the storm. He had shown her a piece of the truth she was so desperate to find. In the quiet of the hidden spring, surrounded by the ancient rocks, a silent alliance was forged, born not of words, but of a shared and dangerous knowledge. The journey back to San Miguel was a pilgrimage of dust and silence. They walked. The sun beat down on them, a physical weight on their shoulders. Nantan moved with an economy of motion that Eliza tried to emulate, placing her feet carefully to conserve energy, breathing slowly through her nose to keep the dust from her lungs. The heat shimmered off the rocks, making the world waver and distort. They spoke little. Words were an extravagance the desert did not afford. Their purpose was a shared, unspoken thing, a heavy stone carried between them. For Eliza, every step was an act of rebellion. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it had been joined by a hard, unyielding anger. She thought of the men in the saloon, their faces closed and hostile. She thought of the council, dismissing her life with a few self-serving words. They had called her a liar, a sympathizer, a fool. She would make them see the truth. She had to reclaim her name. Her dignity was as vital as the water Nantan carried in his leather pouch. Nantan's motives were etched on his face, in the grim set of his jaw and the constant, watchful sweep of his eyes. He moved through his own land as a trespasser, his people pushed to the edges, their sacred places threatened, their lives forfeit to the greed of men like Rourke. He had told her, in the cool quiet of the oasis, about his younger brother, killed in a skirmish started over a stolen horse, a life traded for a piece of property. He fought not for vengeance, but for an end to the senseless waste, for the right of his people to exist, to drink from their own springs without fear of steel traps. As they paused to rest in the sparse shade of a palo verde tree, Nantan unwrapped a long object from a piece of canvas. It was a Spencer carbine, its wooden stock worn smooth, its metal parts oiled and clean. He held it out to her. "You must know this," he said. "It is a tool, nothing more." She took it, surprised by its weight. It was heavier than she had imagined, a solid, dense thing of wood and steel. "I do not know how to shoot," she confessed, her voice small. He nodded, as if he expected this. He took her through the motions, his instructions spare and precise. How to load the tube magazine in the stock, how to work the lever, the crisp metallic sound of the action ejecting a spent shell and chambering a new one, how to sight down the barrel. His hands guided hers, his touch impersonal and firm, the touch of a teacher. He set a piece of dried cholla cactus on a rock 50 paces away. "Do not think of the noise," he said, his voice calm beside her ear. "Do not think of the kick. Look only at the target. See where the bullet must go. The gun does not decide. You decide." She lifted the carbine to her shoulder, the metal butt plate cold against her dress. She remembered his words. Looked down the barrel until the small cactus was perfectly aligned with the sight. She held her breath and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a shocking violence against the silence of the desert. The carbine bucked hard against her shoulder. A painful, surprising force. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust a foot to the left of the target. She had flinched, her body betraying her will. "Again," he said. She reloaded, the motion clumsy. She settled herself, forced her muscles to relax, and fired again. This time, the bullet struck the rock just below the cactus, sending a spray of stone chips into the air. Again. On the third shot, the piece of cactus disintegrated. A small, strange thrill went through her, a feeling of power that was both frightening and satisfying. She had willed it, and it had happened. He took the carbine from her, his expression unreadable. "Now you know," he said, wrapping the weapon back in its canvas. It was a somber graduation. She was no longer just a teacher. She was a woman who knew how to use a gun, a piece of knowledge that felt like a betrayal of the gentle world she had once tried to build. They arrived at the edge of San Miguel just as the sun reached its zenith. The noon bell in the white wooden church began to toll, each slow, deliberate peal ringing out over the town. The sound, which had once seemed a call to prayer and community, now sounded like a funeral dirge. The main street was busy. It was a market day. and ranchers from the surrounding homesteads had come into town for supplies. The air was thick with the smell of livestock, dust, and frying food. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. A sudden hush fell over the part of the street they entered. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. The sight of her, the disgraced teacher, walking beside an Apache warrior, was a spectacle that stopped all commerce. Fear and hostility radiated from the crowd like heat from a blacksmith's forge. Men moved to stand in front of their women, their hands dropping to rest on the handles of their pistols. Eliza ignored them. She kept her eyes fixed on the sheriff's office, a small, false-fronted building with a tarnished star nailed to the door. Nantan walked beside her, his expression a mask of stoic indifference. But she could feel the tension in him, a coiled stillness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. Sheriff Greeley was tilted back in his chair on the boardwalk, a toothpick dangling from his lips. He watched them approach, his eyes lazy and contemptuous. He did not bother to stand. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he drawled, spitting the toothpick into the dust. "Come back to cause more trouble." "Mistress Hart." "I came back to deliver the truth." "Sheriff," Eliza said, her voice steady. "The wagon was not attacked by the Apache. It was staged. I have proof." Greeley chuckled, a low, rumbling sound from deep in his belly. "Proof." He shook his head. "Lady, you have got a powerful imagination, I will give you that. Now, you and your friend here best be moving on before you get the good people of this town all stirred up." "He has proof as well," Eliza insisted, gesturing to Nantan. "There are traps, steel traps, set by the water holes on Apache land." At that moment, Jed Rourke emerged from the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He surveyed the scene with the look of a man watching a play he had written himself. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "What is all this commotion?" Sheriff Rourke asked, though he knew perfectly well. "Ah, Mistress Hart, I had heard you had left us, and you have brought one of your friends with you." "He is not a raider," Eliza said, turning on Rourke, her anger flaring. "He is a guide, and he is a witness to your lies." Rourke's smile widened. "My lies?" He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes scanning the gathered crowd. He raised his voice so all could hear. "This woman, cast out from her position for filling our children's heads with nonsense, now returns with a savage at her side. She speaks of lies. But what is the real lie here? They come into our town, bold as brass. They come to spy on us, to see our defenses, to plan their next raid. They come to threaten our women and children." A murmur went through the crowd, an ugly, growling sound. Rourke's words were a poison, turning their fear into a weapon. "They come to rob you," Rourke shouted, pointing a finger at them. "To take what is yours." "That is not true," Eliza cried, but her voice was lost in the rising anger of the mob. Rourke's men, the members of his voluntary guard, began to emerge from the crowd, separating themselves from the townsfolk. They were hard men with cold eyes, and they moved with a purpose. They began to circle Eliza and Nantan. Nantan did not move. He simply stood, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. He was a stone in a rushing river of hatred, unmovable. Greeley finally heaved himself to his feet. "All right, that is enough." He drew his pistol, but he pointed it at Nantan, not at the mob. "You are under arrest," he said to Nantan, "for inciting a riot." Two of Rourke's men lunged at Nantan from behind. He moved with a speed that was startling, spinning out of their grasp. One man went down with a fist to the jaw. Nantan disarmed the other, sending his pistol skittering across the dust. But there were too many of them. Another man brought the barrel of his rifle down hard on Nantan's shoulder. He grunted in pain. Stumbling, and they swarmed him, bearing him to the ground under a pile of bodies. Two other men grabbed Eliza, their hands rough on her arms. One of them snatched the carpet bag from her hand and dumped its contents onto the dusty ground. Her clothes, her few personal belongings, and her journal, the one in which she had meticulously recorded everything she had seen, spilled into the dirt. Rourke bent down and picked up the journal. He flipped through the pages with a theatrical air of disgust. "So many stories," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "She writes down her fantasies, her lies about good, hard-working men. This is your proof." He tore a handful of pages from the journal and let them flutter away on the hot wind. Someone produced a rope, and they bound Nantan's hands tightly behind his back, hauling him to his feet. A trickle of blood ran from a cut on his temple, but his eyes were clear and defiant. They shoved him toward the center of the square, tying the other end of the rope to a hitching post, leaving him exposed under the brutal noon sun. As they dragged Eliza toward the sheriff's office, she looked past the angry faces of the mob to the silent, white church. Its steeple pointed toward the empty sky, a monument to a God who was not listening. The bell was silent now. The call for justice had been swallowed by the roar of the crowd. They pushed her into the dim, stifling back room of the office, which served as a holding cell. It was small and smelled of sweat and despair. The deputy who shoved her inside was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a dusting of freckles and scared, uncertain eyes. His name was Tommy Hale. As the heavy wooden door swung shut, he pressed something small and cold into her palm. His whisper was barely audible. "My brother worked for the railroad. He knew what Rourke was doing. Rourke had him silenced a month ago. Said it was a riding accident." The door boomed shut, and the heavy bar dropped into place, plunging her into near darkness. She was left alone with the young deputy's desperate words hanging in the air. She opened her hand. Lying in her palm was a heavy iron key. It was not freedom, not yet, but it was a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness. It was hope. The darkness in the holding cell was a thick, breathing thing. It was not empty, but filled with the ghosts of past prisoners, their despair soaked into the rough wooden walls. For hours, Eliza sat on the hard-packed earth floor, the iron key a cold, heavy promise in her fist, through the small, barred window high on the wall. The brutal white of the afternoon slowly softened to the bruised purple of twilight, and then faded to black. The sounds of San Miguel changed with the light. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer gave way to the rowdy music of the saloon, the shouts of drunken men, and the hollow laughter of the women who worked there. She heard Jed Rourke's voice once, a confident, booming sound that cut through the noise, and her hatred for him burned with a clean, cold flame. She waited. Patience was a lesson the desert had taught her, a lesson in waiting for the heat to break, for the rare rain to fall. She listened as the town drank itself into a stupor. The music grew louder, then more sporadic. Fights broke out and sputtered to a close. Finally, a deep, exhausted silence began to settle over the wooden buildings, a silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. It was time. The key felt slick with sweat in her hand. She slid it into the heavy iron lock. It was old and stiff, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought it would not turn. She put her entire body into it, her muscles straining, until with a loud, grating groan, the bolt slid back. The sound was a thunderclap in the stillness. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening. But no one came. The town slept the sleep of the drunk and the self-righteous. She eased the heavy door open a crack and slipped out into the main office. A single lantern on the sheriff's desk cast long, dancing shadows. A deputy she did not recognize was slumped in the sheriff's chair, his hat tilted over his eyes, a soft snore whistling from his lips. She moved past him on silent feet, her breath held tight in her chest. The front door was not locked. She lifted the latch with infinite care and stepped out onto the boardwalk, melting into the deep shadows cast by the overhang. The street was empty. The moon was a slender sliver, providing little light. The stars, however, were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds against black velvet, a sight of breathtaking beauty that felt like a cruel joke in her current predicament. In the center of the street, a dark shape was slumped against the hitching post. Nantan. Getting to him was the most dangerous part of the journey. The street was an open space, a killing ground. She stayed in the shadows, moving from the sheriff's office to the deep darkness beside the general store, then flitting across the alleyway to the saloon. From there, she had a clear view. He was still, and for a terrible moment, she thought he might be dead. Then she saw the slight rise and fall of his shoulders. She took a deep, steadying breath and ran. Her soft shoes made no sound in the thick dust. She reached him, her hand fumbling in her pocket for the small knife she kept for mending. The rope was thick and tight, cutting into his wrists. She sawed at the fibers, her own breath loud in her ears. The rope parted with a soft snap. He slumped forward, and she caught him, his weight a surprise. He was not a large man, but he was dense with muscle, and the long day under the sun had weakened him severely. He stirred, lifting his head. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, found hers. He did not speak. He did not need to. A single slow nod was enough. He pushed himself up, his movement stiff with pain. They stood for a moment, two ghosts in the silent town, before turning and disappearing into the darkness at the end of the street, heading for the wide, pale ribbon of the dry riverbed that curled around the town's southern edge. The wash was their only hope. Its high, crumbling banks offered cover, and the soft sand would obscure their tracks. They moved down the bank, the sand sliding and shifting under their feet. It was slow going. Nantan was moving with a noticeable limp, his shoulders stiff from the rifle blow. Eliza stayed close, ready to steady him if he stumbled. Behind them, back in the town, a dog began to bark, a frantic, angry sound that was soon joined by another. A light flickered in the window of the sheriff's office. A shout cut through the night. They had been discovered. "Run," she whispered, a useless command. They plunged deeper into the wash, their flight now desperate. The sounds of the pursuit grew louder. Men shouting, the jingle of harnesses, the flare of lanterns on the ridge above them. They were hunting them like animals. The beams of light swept back and forth across the dry riverbed. Searching, Eliza and Nantan pressed themselves against the bank, the rough earth scraping their skin, trying to make themselves invisible. A lantern beam passed directly over them, and Eliza's heart stopped. But the light kept moving, and they were safe. For another few seconds. They ran again, stumbling through the soft sand, their lungs burning. The posse was moving along the ridge, faster than they could move in the wash. A shot rang out, the crack of a rifle echoing off the canyon walls. The bullet whined past Eliza's ear and slammed into the bank beside them, showering them with dirt. Another shot, and this time, Nantan cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. He stumbled and fell to one knee. "They have seen us," she said, her voice shaking. He pushed himself up, his face a tight mask. A ricochet. He grunted, "It is nothing." But it was not nothing. When they found a deeper overhang, a small cave carved by 1,000 years of flash floods, and huddled inside, she saw the dark stain spreading across his trouser leg, just above the knee. The lantern lights were moving away, the posse assuming their quarry would continue fleeing down the wash. For the moment, they were hidden. "Let me see," she said, her voice taking on an authority that surprised them both. He sat, his back against the cool earth of the cave wall, and did not protest. In the faint starlight that filtered into their hiding place, she knelt and gently tore the fabric of his trousers. It was not a clean wound. A piece of the bullet, or a shard of rock sent flying by its impact, had torn a ragged gash in the muscle. It was bleeding freely. Without a second thought, she reached under her dress and ripped a long, clean strip from her petticoat. Her hands, which had trembled with fear only moments before, were now steady as she cleaned the wound as best she could with a little water from Nantan's skin. He hissed in pain as she worked, but he did not pull away. She wrapped the makeshift bandage tightly around his leg, her touch firm and sure. When she was done, she sat back on her heels. The roles were reversed. He, the strong, capable survivor who had rescued her from the storm, was now the one who was wounded, dependent on her care. A new, deeper connection formed between them in the shared vulnerability of the darkness. He watched her, his dark eyes shadowed and unreadable. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet but sincere. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak, her fingers, resting on his uninjured leg, brushed against a network of older scars, raised white lines that crisscrossed his skin. He did not flinch from her touch. "Where did these come from?" she asked softly, tracing a long, thin scar on his calf. "Soldiers," he said, his voice flat, "at Apache Pass, many years ago." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. Then, as if a dam had broken inside him, he began to speak. His voice was low, a monotone that did nothing to hide the deep well of pain beneath the surface. He told her about his brother, Swiftwater. He had not been a warrior, but a maker of songs, a gentle soul who saw beauty in the world. He had been captured by a group of prospectors who accused him of stealing a mule. It was a lie, a pretext. They wanted the small patch of land where his family had their winter camp, a place with good water. "They did not kill him quickly," Nantan said, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the darkness. "They made a sport of it. For a mule." The story hung in the small space between them, a testament to the casual cruelty that had shaped his life, and the world they both now had to navigate. Eliza felt a profound ache in her chest, a sorrow that went beyond pity. It was a recognition of a shared wound. Her parents, his brother, Tommy Hale's brother, all victims of the same insatiable greed. The labels that had defined them, settler and savage, teacher and warrior, fell away, leaving only two people, scarred and hunted, huddled together in the dark. To ward off the night's chill, he showed her how to build a small, smokeless fire. Using dry mesquite roots that burned hot and clean, they tucked it into a hollow at the back of the cave, shielding its meager light with a wall of stones. The tiny flame threw their shadows against the earthen wall, making them giants. In the discreet, intimate warmth, they shared a piece of dried meat and the last of the water. Later, after the fire had died to a bed of glowing embers, they sat at the mouth of the cave, looking out. The posse was long gone. The night was peaceful again. The great sweep of the Milky Way was a river of light across the sky, so close it felt as if she could reach up and touch it. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It is our map," he said. "The stars show us the way home. They are a freedom that no man can fence in." They sat like that for a long time, watching the constellations turn. The freedom he spoke of felt impossibly distant, yet the sight of it was a balm to her soul. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, they heard the sound of riders approaching, not from the direction of the town, but from further down the wash. They pressed themselves back into the darkness of the cave. Two men on horseback trotted past on the ridge above them, their figures silhouetted against the coming dawn, their voices carried clearly in the still air. "Rourke is pleased," one man said. "He meets with the railroad man from Tucson in 2 days. The contract is all but signed." "And the Apache?" the other asked. "Once the contract is signed, the Army has its orders. They will clear the territory, drive them up past the Gila River for good. It will be a clean sweep." The riders passed, their voices fading into the distance. Eliza looked at Nantan. The hope of escape, of simply surviving the night, was gone, replaced by a new and terrible urgency. It was no longer just about their lives, or clearing her name. It was about his people, about preventing a slaughter. "The proof," she said, her voice a low, determined whisper. "It has to be in his ledgers, in the railroad warehouse, the payments to his men, the weapons he bought, everything." Nantan looked at her, and, in the growing light, She saw a new fire in his eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. The stars had shown them the way, and now the careless words of their enemies had shown them the battlefield. They were no longer just running. They were hunting. The sky was the color of a day-old bruise, a deep, starless purple that precedes the dawn. They moved through this half-light, two shadows against a landscape of shadows. Nantan's limp was more pronounced now, a steady, rhythmic pain he endured without complaint. He led them along the base of the foothills, circling San Miguel, approaching it from the east, where the land flattened out and the new railroad spur line gleamed dully in the faint light. The warehouse stood apart from the main town, a long, low block of a building made of raw pine and roofed with corrugated iron. It was a monument to Rourke's ambition, a stark, ugly intrusion on the landscape. They found cover in a shallow arroyo 100 yards from the building, and watched. A single lantern burned near the large double doors, casting a weak, yellow circle of light. A man with a rifle walked a slow, predictable circuit around the warehouse, his boots crunching on the gravel. His partner was a motionless lump in a chair tilted against the wall, clearly asleep. Nantan watched the guard for a long time, his breathing slow and even. He was studying the man's rhythm, the length of his stride, the moments he paused to look out into the darkness. He was not merely looking at the guard, he was learning him, understanding the shape of his boredom and fatigue. The plan was simple, communicated with a few quiet words and hand gestures. Nantan would deal with the guards. Eliza's task was to get inside the small office built into the front corner of the warehouse and find the ledgers. He handed her a small, flat piece of steel, a tool for prying, and a length of leather thong. "If you find what we need," he said, his voice a low whisper, "you will not be able to carry a large book. Take only the pages." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers in the dimness. "Be quick, the sun is a fast rider." Then he was gone. He did not run or crawl. He simply dissolved into the landscape, using the sparse cover of creosote bushes and the deep shadows between them. Eliza's heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a teacher, a woman who had lived her life among books and quiet principles. Now she was a burglar, an accomplice, a fugitive cowering in a ditch while a warrior went to do violence on her behalf. She watched the walking guard disappear around the far corner of the building. This was Nantan's moment. She saw a flicker of movement near the sleeping man, a deeper shadow detaching itself from the greater shadow of the wall. There was no sound, no struggle. The slumped figure in the chair simply went limp, his head lolling to one side. Nantan had moved with the swift, silent deadliness of a hawk. Eliza counted the seconds, her breath catching in her throat. The walking guard reappeared, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He walked toward the chair, perhaps to wake his partner. He reached out a hand. The shadow that was Nantan rose up behind him. There was a brief, sharp scuffle of boots on gravel, a muffled grunt, and then silence. The second guard crumpled to the ground. A low whistle, the call of a nighthawk, reached her from the darkness. The signal. She ran, her feet flying over the open ground. As she got closer, she could see that Nantan had already dragged both unconscious men into the deep shadow beside the loading dock. He was methodically binding their hands and feet with leather thongs he had taken from their own gear. He worked with a calm efficiency that was both terrifying and reassuring. "Why do you not kill them?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt beside him. "It would be safer." He paused, his hands tightening a knot. He looked at the face of the young man at his feet, his features slack in unconsciousness. "He is paid to stand here," Nantan said, his voice low and firm. "He does not believe in Rourke's cause. He believes in the coin in his pocket. He is a fool, but he is not our enemy. To kill a man for his foolishness is to become a fool yourself. We are not murderers." Eliza. The use of her name, the simple, direct statement of their shared morality, steadied her. He was right. That was the line they could not cross, the line that separated them from men like Rourke. The office window was unlatched. Nantan boosted her up, his hand strong and sure at her waist, and she slid through into the small, dark room. It smelled of stale cigar smoke, whiskey, and leather. She landed in a crouch, her senses on high alert. Nantan slipped in behind her as silently as a cat. She moved to the desk. It was large and imposing, made of dark, heavy oak. A thick ledger lay open on its surface, by the faint light coming through the window. She scanned the pages. It was all legitimate business. Shipments of lumber, barrels of nails, wages for honest work crews. Rourke was clever. He would not leave his crimes out in the open. She began to search the desk, her fingers moving quickly through the drawers. They were filled with shipping manifests, contracts, letters, nothing. Nantan stood guard at the door, a motionless silhouette, his attention focused on the sounds of the coming dawn. The first birds were beginning to sing. Time was running out. Frustration clawed at her. It had to be here. She ran her hands along the underside of the desk, searching for a hidden compartment. Nothing. She stood up, her eyes sweeping the room, and noticed a small, locked strongbox on the floor, tucked away in the corner. Nantan came over. He examined the lock for a moment, then inserted the tip of his knife into the keyhole. With a sharp twist and a horrible screech of protesting metal, the lock sprang open. Inside were two smaller ledgers and a stack of papers tied with a ribbon. Eliza carried them to the window, using the first pale light of day to read. The first ledger was filled with names, many of which she recognized. Men who rode with Rourke. Beside each name was a series of dates and sums of money. The payments were listed under the heading Security. It was a payroll for his private army of thugs. She found a large payment recorded for the day after the faked wagon raid. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with a grim triumph. But the second ledger held a revelation far more sinister. It was a record of transactions with a trading company based in Nogales, Mexico, a company Nantan recognized by name as a notorious gunrunner. The entries were coded, disguised as purchases of mining equipment and agricultural tools, but the numbers did not add up. The weights were too high, the costs too specific. "Look at this," she said, her finger tracing a line. 10 crates of plowshares, weighing over 2,000 pounds, shipped last month. "Plowshares are not so heavy," Nantan said, his voice grim. "Rifles are." She flipped through the pages, her excitement turning to ice in her veins. There were dozens of such entries. Rourke had been arming a small army for months, and then she found the final piece, a letter tucked into the back of the book. It was from the arms dealer in Nogales, confirming a new, final shipment. It spoke of delivering the hardware for the big celebration and was dated for the following day. It mentioned a rendezvous point, a dry canyon north of town. "He is not just planning to clear the territory," Eliza said, the horror of it dawning on her. "He is planning a massacre. He will arm his men with these new rifles, stage another, bigger attack, and make it look like a full-scale Apache uprising. The army will have no choice but to retaliate. They will wipe out everyone." The first rays of the sun streamed through the window, striking the page in her hand. The ink, the neat, precise script of the clerk who had recorded these transactions, seemed to burn with a black, unholy light. These were not just numbers and words. They were death sentences, written out in advance. Nantan took the pages from her hand. His face was a mask of cold fury. "This is the proof we need," he said. Eliza tore the relevant pages from both ledgers. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was like steel. They had found the truth, a truth far more terrible than they had imagined. They slipped back out the window as the first whistle of the morning train sounded in the distance. They left the two guards bound and unconscious in the shadows. They had taken what they came for, and left life undisturbed. They made their way back to the relative safety of the foothills as the town of San Miguel began to wake. The sun was climbing, burning away the morning chill. Eliza clutched the stolen pages to her chest. They felt fragile, insubstantial. Yet they held the weight of hundreds of lives. They were a record of a crime not yet committed, a prophecy written in black ink. She looked at Nantan, at the hard line of his jaw, the fire in his eyes. They had started this journey as two separate people, a disgraced teacher and a solitary warrior, running for their lives. Now, they were something else entirely. They were allies, bound by a shared purpose, and they were no longer running from the storm. They were walking directly into its heart. The thin, stolen papers felt both as heavy as a tombstone and as fragile as a dead leaf in Eliza's hands. They were the truth, but the truth was a dangerous and delicate thing in this land. They spent the day hidden deep in a rocky crevasse, allowing Nantan's leg to rest. He showed her how to make a poultice of chewed juniper leaves to draw out the inflammation, a piece of knowledge passed down through generations, far more useful than anything she had ever read in a book. His wound was stiff and painful, but he bore it with a stoicism that was both admirable and worrying. They could not stay hidden forever. The words they had overheard from Rourke's men echoed in their minds. A contract to be signed, a final shipment of rifles, a clean sweep. Time was their enemy, a relentless sun marching across the sky. Nantan knew a man, an old rancher named Elias Thorne, who lived a few miles north, a stubborn holdout whose small spread was a thorn in the side of Rourke's grand vision for the railroad. Thorne's water had been diverted, his fences cut, his cattle scattered, all in an effort to drive him out. He had no love for the railroad man. They reached his small, defensible adobe house at dusk. Thorne was a man who looked as though he had been carved from the same rock as the mountains, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, faded blue. He listened to their story without interruption, his gnarled hands resting on the stock of a shotgun that never left his side. He looked from Eliza's earnest, desperate face to Nantan's grim, pain-etched features. He had seen enough of Rourke's justice to know the truth when he heard it. He gave them food, fresh water, and a horse, a strong, sturdy buckskin that had a calm eye and a steady gait. More importantly, he gave them news. A circuit judge, a man named Miller, was due to pass through on his way to Tucson. He was expected in San Miguel tomorrow. "This is your chance," Thorne said, his voice a dry rasp. "Miller is a hard man, but they say he is fair. If you can get those papers into his hands, he will have to act. The law is the only thing men like Rourke fear." The hope was a fragile thing, but it was enough. They left before dawn, the buckskin carrying them both, Eliza riding in front of Nantan, his body a warm, solid presence at her back. His rifle was in its canvas sheath, tied to the saddle. They did not ride for town, but for a high, lonely hill a few miles out on the Tucson road. It was a windswept place, home to San Miguel's small, neglected cemetery. From there, they could watch the road, intercept the judge before he ever reached the corrupting influence of the town, of Rourke and his sheriff. The cemetery was a sad, quiet place. The wooden markers were bleached gray by the sun, their names and dates worn away by the wind and the dust. A few more permanent tombstones of carved stone stood like lonely sentinels, their surfaces coated in a fine red powder. It was a place of forgotten memories, a testament to the high price of life in this unforgiving land. They settled behind the largest of the stones, a monument to a family lost to cholera, and waited. The morning passed in tense silence. Nantan's wound was clearly paining him, but his attention never wavered from the road below. Eliza felt the fear returning, a familiar cold companion. The pages in her pocket felt heavy, a burden of proof that could just as easily get them killed. Around mid-morning, Nantan stiffened. He pointed not to the road, but to a rocky outcrop on the other side of the hill. 2 riders, Rourke's men. They had been found. The discovery of the break-in, the missing pages, had sent Rourke's hounds sniffing. They had been tracked. The first rifle shot came without warning. It was not aimed at them, but at their horse. The buckskin screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pain and terror. and collapsed, its front legs shattered. The single calculated shot had destroyed their escape, stranding them among the dead. Eliza scrambled for cover, pressing herself against the cold stone of a grave marker as a second bullet kicked up a cloud of dust where she had been standing. Nantan was already moving, dragging the Spencer carbine from its sheath, his face a grim mask. He pushed Eliza behind the cholera monument, the thickest piece of cover they had. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice sharp. He crawled to the edge of the monument. Resting the rifle on the stone base, he fired, a single, measured shot. A cry of pain came from the rocks opposite them. One of the gunmen was hit. The return fire was immediate and furious, a hail of lead that chipped and whined off the tombstones, sending shards of stone flying like shrapnel. They were pinned. Nantan fired again, but the gunmen were well hidden, their positions hard to pinpoint. A bullet ricocheted, and Nantan flinched, a fresh line of red appearing high on his cheekbone. He was bleeding from 2 wounds now, his movement slightly slower. The world narrowed for Eliza to the space behind the stone, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air, the sound of the bullets a terrifying song of death. The fear was a living thing inside her, paralyzing her, turning her limbs to water. This was it. This was where it ended, in a dusty, forgotten graveyard. One of the gunmen, taking advantage of Nantan's split second of distraction, broke cover. He ran in a low crouch, moving from the rocks to a smaller cluster of graves closer to their position, trying to get a better angle. Nantan saw him and fired, but the shot went wide. The carbine was empty. As Nantan worked the lever to reload, his movement slowed by the stiffness in his shoulder. The gunman rose from behind a small wooden cross. He had a clear shot. He brought his pistol up, taking aim at Nantan's exposed back. Time seemed to slow down. Eliza saw it all with a terrible clarity. The gunman's face, a cruel sneer of triumph. Nantan, struggling with the rifle, completely vulnerable. The black, unblinking eye of the pistol barrel. In that instant, something broke inside Eliza. The fear did not vanish, but it was burned away by a white-hot rage. Rage at Rourke, at the gunman, at the sheer, brutal injustice of it all. This man, Nantan, had saved her life, had shown her kindness, had trusted her. She would not watch him die. She did not remember reaching for the pistol that was still tucked in the waistband of her skirt. She did not remember cocking the hammer. She remembered Nantan's lesson. Do not think of the noise. Do not think of the kick. See where the bullet must go. She rose from behind the tombstone, the pistol held steady in both hands. She saw the gunman's eyes widen in surprise as he saw her. She saw the muzzle of his pistol begin to turn toward her. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The pistol jumped in her hands, but she held it steady. The gunman jerked backward as if struck by an invisible fist. The triumphant sneer on his face was replaced by a look of blank shock. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He stood for a second, a marionette with its strings cut, then collapsed into the dust behind the wooden cross. Silence. A profound, ringing silence fell over the cemetery. The second gunman, seeing his partner fall, fired one last panicked shot that went wide, then scrambled for his horse and fled. Eliza stood frozen, the pistol still extended, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel. She looked at the still figure on the ground, then at her own hands. They were steady. She had taken a human life. There was no sense of victory, no triumph, only a cold, hollow ache. It had been a choice. A terrible choice made in a dirty world. She had chosen to save a life, and the cost was a piece of her own soul. Nantan stared at her, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else, something she could not name. He finished reloading the carbine, his movement sure again. From the road below came the sound of an approaching carriage, a fine black carriage pulled by 2 matched gray horses. Judge Miller had arrived. Hope, battered but not extinguished, surged back, It was not too late. They half ran, half stumbled down the hill, Nantan leaning on her for support. They reached the road just as the carriage pulled alongside them. The driver reined in the horses. The window of the carriage lowered, and a man's face appeared. He was in his 50s, with a florid complexion, silver sideburns, and the stern, impatient look of a man used to being in charge. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice a deep baritone. "Judge Miller," Eliza said, her voice breathless, "you must help us. There is a conspiracy, a plan to murder innocent people. We have proof." She held out the folded pages. The judge looked from her disheveled appearance to Nantan's blood-stained clothes, his expression one of deep distaste. He took the papers from her with the tips of his fingers, as if they were contaminated. He began to read. As he scanned the pages, a new sound reached them, the thunder of hooves. A group of riders was approaching fast from the direction of San Miguel. At their head were Jed Rourke and Sheriff Greeley. Eliza's heart sank. They were caught. Rourke reined in his horse, a look of mock concern on his face. "Judge Miller, is there a problem? These two are dangerous fugitives. We were just coming to ensure your safe passage into town." Judge Miller lowered the papers. He looked at Eliza, his eyes cold and hard. "Madam," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "these are serious accusations, based on nothing more than stolen documents and the word of a known troublemaker and a renegade Apache." He folded the pages neatly and, to Eliza's horror, handed them to Jed Rourke. "It seems to me," the judge continued, "that this is a simple matter of a dispute over railroad business. I am sure you can handle it. Mr. Rourke, I will not have my court cluttered with such hysterical nonsense." He raised his voice to his driver. "Carry on." The driver cracked his whip, and the carriage lurched forward, leaving them standing in a cloud of dust. Rourke smiled, a slow, triumphant smile. He tucked the pages into his coat pocket. "Thank you for returning my property," he said to Eliza. "Greeley will escort you back to town. We have a cell waiting for you. And as for your friend, we have a rope." The world seemed to tilt under Eliza's feet. The law, the great, impartial pillar of justice she had believed in, was a sham. It was a tool, another weapon in Rourke's arsenal. They had lost. But as Rourke's men began to move forward, a voice, young and clear, cut through the tension. "That is enough." It was Deputy Tommy Hale. He had ridden up with the posse, but now he separated his horse from the group, drawing his pistol. He leveled it not at Eliza or Nantan, but at Sheriff Greeley. "The law is not your personal property, Sheriff," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "Nor yours, Mr. Rourke." The standoff was a brittle, fragile thing. Greeley and Rourke stared at their own deputy in stunned disbelief. Before anyone could react, Nantan moved. He grabbed Eliza's arm and pulled her back, away from the road, toward the rocks and the safety of the hills. "We cannot win this fight. Not here, not now," he said, his voice low and urgent. As they scrambled up the rocky slope, they looked back. Tommy Hale was still holding the others at bay, creating the diversion they needed. They had escaped again, but their last hope for a lawful resolution had turned to ash. They watched from a high ledge as the judge's carriage, Rourke's posse, and the brave young deputy disappeared toward town. They were alone again, with nothing but the truth and the clothes on their backs. "The judge will not help us," Eliza said, the words a hollow admission of defeat. "The law is bought." Nantan looked toward the town, his face grim. The law of one man is not the only law. There are others in that town, people who know the truth. The young deputy, the woman at the saloon, Maeve, she sees everything, hears everything, even the preacher, Reverend Asher. He's a good man, trapped in a town of cowards. Eliza looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. It was not a judge, one powerful man who would save them. It was the people. They had to be convinced, to be made brave. "Our witnesses," she said, That is all we have left." "It is enough," Nantan said. They turned their backs on the road to Tucson and began the long walk back toward the corrupt heart of San Miguel. They were no longer seeking justice from the law. They were going to have to make it themselves. They found their sanctuary as twilight bled across the desert, a place Nantan had known since he was a boy. It was a shallow cave carved by a forgotten river, hidden behind a curtain of willows that grew thick and green around a warm, spring-fed stream. The water bubbled up from the earth, clear and pure, creating a small, deep pool before spilling out to lose itself in the sand. It was a secret place of life, an impossible haven in the harsh, dying landscape. The air here was different, soft and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and willow leaves instead of dust and blood. Eliza slid from the horse, her body aching with a weariness that went deeper than her muscles. Nantan dismounted more slowly, his face tight with the effort of ignoring the pain in his leg. He led the horse to the stream to drink before hobbling back to the mouth of the cave. First, the water. They knelt side by side at the edge of the pool. The water was surprisingly warm, like a gentle caress. Eliza cupped it in her hands, washing the grime and dried blood from her face and arms. The simple act felt like a baptism, a washing away of the cemetery's horrors. She watched Nantan lower his face to the water, the tension in his shoulders easing as the warmth soaked into him. Inside the rock shelter, he built a small, contained fire that offered more warmth than light, its glow a discreet and private thing. The silence between them was no longer one of necessity or caution, but of shared exhaustion. The adrenaline of the fight and flight had ebbed away, leaving behind the raw, aching truth of their position. They were fugitives. Their proof was gone, and tomorrow they would walk into a town that wanted them dead. Eliza took the strip of cloth she had used as a bandage and soaked it in the warm stream. She came and sat before him, wordlessly gesturing to the gash on his cheekbone. He was still for a moment, his gaze searching hers in the flickering firelight. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She gently cleaned the wound, her touch as light as a moth's wing. He did not flinch, but she felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. His leg was worse. The bandage was soaked through. She removed it carefully, revealing the swollen, angry flesh. The wound needed to be cleaned properly. She tore another, longer strip from her petticoat and returned to the stream. When she came back, he had his knife out, the blade gleaming. He held it in the fire's flame until the steel glowed a dull red. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. He saw her fear. "It must be done," he said, his voice a low rasp, "to stop the poison." She understood. She knelt before him, the wet cloth in her hand. "Do it," she said, her own voice a whisper. He did not hesitate. He pressed the hot blade against the deepest part of the wound. The smell of seared flesh filled the small cave. His whole body went rigid, a single, sharp hiss of breath escaping his lips. But he made no other sound. Eliza immediately pressed the cool, wet cloth to the wound, her hand trembling. He reached out and covered her hand with his own, his grip surprisingly gentle. "It is done," he said. She stayed like that for a long moment, her hand pressed to his leg, his hand covering hers, a strange and powerful current passing between them. When she finally looked up, his eyes were on her. They were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. Later, after she had bandaged his leg with the clean cloth, they sat by the fire, sharing a piece of Elias Thorne's dried beef. The warmth of the flames pushed back the desert's nightly chill. "Are you afraid?" she asked, the question so quiet it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. He considered the question for a long time, staring into the embers. "Fear is a sharp stone," he said finally. "You can let it cut your feet and bleed you slow, or you can pick it up and use it to sharpen your knife. My fear is not for myself. It is for the stories, for the children who will not know the songs of their grandfathers. It is for the memory of the water and the land. If we are silenced, all of that dies with us." "And you?" he asked, turning his gaze on her. What is your fear? That the truth is not enough, she confessed. That it can be bought and sold and buried, and that the world will just keep turning. That my life, my parents' lives, will have meant nothing at all. She looked at her hands, the hands that had taken a life that day. And I'm afraid of what I had to become to survive. You became a warrior, he said simply, without judgment. You chose to protect a life. There is no shame in that choice. You fought for something. That is what matters. They sat in a comfortable silence for a time. The unspoken horrors of the day acknowledged and set aside. He told her of the symbols carved on the rock walls of other, older shelters. Stories of creation and survival. She told him of the books her father had loved. Stories of faraway places where justice was a thing of stone and marble. Not a desperate gamble in the dust. They were building a bridge between their two worlds. A fragile structure made of words and shared understanding. The fire burned low, the shadows deepening around them. A shiver, born of exhaustion and emotion, ran through her. He saw it. He shifted closer, and with a slow, deliberate movement, he draped his blanket over her shoulders, his arms settling around her. His warmth was a solid, comforting presence. She leaned into it, a sense of safety and peace washing over her that she had not felt in years, perhaps ever. She was no longer just a widow, a teacher, a fugitive. In the circle of his arm, she was simply Eliza. He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. His eyes held a question, a deep and tender inquiry that asked for more than permission. It asked for a choice. Her choice. Here, in this hidden place. There were no labels, no prejudices, no town, no Rourke. There was only the night, the fire, the water, and the profound, undeniable connection between two people who had seen the soul of the other. She lifted a hand to his face, her fingers gently tracing the new, raw line on his cheekbone. He was real. The pain, the loss, the quiet strength. It was all real. And in that moment, she wanted nothing more than to be a part of his reality, to offer him a sanctuary as he had offered one to her. "I want you so bad," she whispered. The Apache's fingers answered, writing fire on her skin. His touch was not a taking, but a giving. It was a language of its own, a silent conversation spoken on her skin. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck. Each touch a discovery, a reverence. He unpinned her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders, and ran his hands through it as if it were a rare and precious thing. There was no haste, no desperation. It was a slow, deliberate healing. As he laid her back on the soft sand of the cave floor, it was an act of profound trust. The wounds of their pasts, the ghosts of her husband and his brother, seemed to recede, pushed back by the powerful, living warmth of the present moment. They moved together with an instinctive grace, their bodies learning each other's rhythms. It was a quiet, tender exploration. A confirmation that even in a world determined to tear them apart, they could create a moment of perfect, unassailable unity. It was a reclamation of the humanity that had been denied them, a defiant act of love in the face of hatred. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms, listening to the soft murmur of the spring and the beating of their own hearts. The world and its dangers were still there, waiting for them with the rising sun. But for this night, they had carved out a space that belonged only to them. Nantan rose and took a piece of charcoal from the edge of the fire, on the smooth, protected wall of the cave. He drew a simple circle, the symbol of life, of the sun, of a world without end. Beside it, he drew two small, stick-like figures. Their hands joined. It was a silent vow, a story written in ash on ancient stone, a promise that whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together. He came back to her side and pulled the blanket over them both, and in the deep, quiet dark of their hidden sanctuary, they slept. The sun was a white-hot coin in the center of the sky. At noon in San Miguel, shadows died. The heat baked the very air, making it thin and hard to breathe. The dust on the main street was a pale, glittering powder. On the last stroke of the church bell tolling the 12th hour, they appeared. They walked out from the alleyway beside the general store, into the center of the town's empty, sun-blasted square, Eliza and Nantan. They moved as one, a single entity of defiance. His arm was around her shoulders, leaning on her for support, his limp a visible testament to their long night. Her arm was around his waist, her strength supporting his. They stopped in the very center of the street, a position of absolute vulnerability, and waited. Heads began to appear in doorways. Faces peeked from behind curtains. The town had been holding its breath, waiting for the confrontation. And now it had arrived. People slowly began to trickle out onto the boardwalks, drawn by a morbid curiosity that was stronger than their fear. Sheriff Greeley emerged from his office, his hand resting on his pistol. Jed Rourke stepped out of the saloon, a look of amused contempt on his face. He was flanked by a dozen of his hired guns, who fanned out, their expressions bored and confident. Eliza's voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and sharp as breaking glass. It carried through the shimmering heat with an unnerving authority. "I was told I was a liar," she began, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the townsfolk, the people who had judged her and cast her out. "I was told I was a fool for believing in the truth. Today, I have come to give that truth to you." Rourke laughed, a short, barking sound. "The teacher is giving a lesson. This should be amusing." Eliza ignored him. Her gaze was fixed on the people. She told them everything she had memorized from the stolen ledgers. She spoke of the payroll, disguised as security expenses, paid to the men who now stood with Rourke. She named the dates of the payments, one of them the day after the faked wagon raid. She spoke of the coded shipments from the gunrunner in Nogales, the crates of plowshares that were in fact repeating rifles. "Lies!" Rourke shouted, his amusement beginning to curdle, the ravings of a hysterical woman and her savage lover. "Is it a lie?" a new voice called out. The crowd parted. Deputy Tommy Hale stepped forward into the sunlit street. He was no longer wearing his badge. He held it in his hand. He looked not at Eliza, but at the sheriff. "My brother, Daniel, was a good man," Tommy said, his voice shaking but clear. "He worked as a surveyor for the railroad. He found out what Rourke was planning. He saw the real maps. He was going to report it. And a week later, he was dead. You told me it was a riding accident. Sheriff, you told me he was drunk and fell into a gully. You lied." He looked at Rourke. He was silenced, just like you plan to silence anyone who stands in your way. Rourke's face was a thundercloud. "You are fired, boy, and you are under arrest for treason." Tommy Hale threw his badge into the dust. "I do not work for you anymore." Rourke had lost control of the narrative. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men. Violence was his final, most trusted argument. The world exploded into noise and chaos. The hired guns drew their pistols and began to advance. A woman screamed. The townsfolk scrambled for cover, pressing themselves into doorways, overturning barrels and troughs to hide behind. But as the first shots were fired, a new and startling sight appeared. At both ends of the main street, figures materialized from the heat haze. A line of Apache warriors, mounted and armed, sat their horses, blocking the exits. They did not charge. They did not yell their war cries. They simply sat, a silent, disciplined wall, cutting off the town from the outside world. Then, more warriors on foot moved with swift purpose, not toward the center of the town, but along the back alleys, opening the rear gates of the corrals, creating pathways for escape away from the main street. It was a brilliant, terrifying, and utterly unexpected maneuver. They were not attacking. They were corralling the violence and showing the townsfolk the way to safety. Nantan had not brought an army to destroy San Miguel. He had brought them to expose the lie. In the midst of the growing chaos, Eliza walked directly toward Jed Rourke, who stood on the saloon boardwalk, his face a mask of incandescent rage. Nantan moved with her, his limp forgotten, his body a shield between her and the gunman. This was never about progress, Eliza shouted over the gunfire. It was never about protecting the town. It was about greed. She pointed a shaking finger at him. You planned to run your railroad track straight through their sacred burial ground. Did you not desecrate the graves of their ancestors for a few extra dollars in your pocket? That is the kind of man you are. Rourke's face contorted in fury. He raised his own pistol. At the same moment, across the street, Sheriff Greeley, seeing his world collapsing, drew his revolver and took careful aim at Eliza's back. Nantan saw it. He moved with a speed that defied his injuries. He shoved Eliza hard, sending her stumbling to the ground behind a horse trough. Just as Rourke's gun fired, the bullet tore through the space where her head had been. Almost simultaneously, Nantan spun, throwing himself in front of her as Greeley's gun bucked in his hand. The bullet struck Nantan high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered, his face a mask of shock and pain, and fell to one knee. The sight of him falling, of his blood darkening the dust of the street, was a spark in a powder keg. But the final, decisive act of madness came from Rourke's own men, panicked by the appearance of the Apache and enraged by the town's defiance. They began to fire indiscriminately. One bullet ripped through a sack of flour on the general store porch, showering a woman and her small child, who were cowering behind it, in a cloud of white dust. Another slammed into the wooden cross atop the church, sending splinters raining down on the people huddled at its doors. That was the moment the heart of San Miguel changed. The townsfolk saw the truth, not in Eliza's words, but in the reckless violence of the men who claimed to be their protectors. The mask had not just slipped, it had been violently torn away. A shotgun roared from the doorway of the blacksmith's shop. Mr. Abernathy, his face grim, worked the action and fired again. From a second-story window, a rancher with a buffalo rifle began to pick off Rourke's men with methodical precision. The fear that had held the town in its grip for so long had finally been burned away by a collective, righteous anger. The crowd was no longer a collection of frightened sheep. It was a pride of lions. Rourke, his face pale with shock, saw his power dissolving in a hail of gunfire from the very people he had terrorized. His hired guns, paid for their loyalty but not to die, began to fall back, their confidence shattered. Greeley, seeing the tide turn so completely, threw down his pistol and ran, a coward to the last. Nantan, clutching his shoulder, pushed himself back to his feet, his teeth gritted against the pain. He stood beside Eliza, who had retrieved his fallen carbine. They stood together in the white-hot noon sun, in the center of a town that was, at long and bloody last, fighting for its own soul. The last gunshot echoed into a ringing, profound silence. For a long moment, the only movement in the white-hot square was the slow curl of gun smoke and the lazy drift of dust. Jed Rourke stood on the saloon boardwalk, his pistol still in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief. The world he had built, a world that ran on fear and bent to his will, had just been torn apart by a blacksmith, a handful of ranchers, and a disgraced schoolteacher. The townsfolk began to emerge from their cover, not with the fear of sheep, but with the slow, deliberate anger of a woken beast. Abernathy, the blacksmith, walked into the center of the street, his shotgun held at his side. He was joined by Elias Thorne, who had ridden in at the sound of the fighting. They did not look at Eliza or Nantan. They looked at Rourke. "It is over," Abernathy said, his voice a low, iron rumble. Rourke stared at them, his mind refusing to accept his defeat. He raised his pistol. "You are nothing," he spat. "I own this town." Before he could fire, a length of rope snaked through the air and settled over his shoulders, pinning his arms to his sides. A young ranch hand on the roof of the general store pulled the rope taut, and Rourke's pistol clattered to the boardwalk. Abernathy and Thorne were on him in a second, disarming him completely. binding his hands with a cold, efficient fury. The architect of San Miguel's misery was now its prisoner. Of Greeley, there was no sign. The sheriff had vanished in the chaos, but as Rourke's remaining gunmen, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons in surrender, a shout went up from the edge of town. A group of ranchers, who had circled around, were riding back, and in their midst was the sheriff, his hands tied, his face a mask of blubbering terror. The town had not just won its battle, it had cleaned its own house. In the center of it all, Nantan sank to the ground, his hand pressed against the bloody ruin of his shoulder. The last of his strength had been spent. Eliza was at his side instantly, her hands moving to staunch the bleeding. Maeve, the saloon owner, came bustling out onto the street, her usual cynical expression replaced by one of fierce, practical concern. "Get him inside," she commanded, her voice cutting through the stunned aftermath. "Not the sheriff's office. My place?" Abernathy and Thorne helped Eliza carry Nantan into the cool, dark interior of the saloon. They laid him on a long poker table, clearing away the cards and glasses. Maeve was already there with a basin of hot water, clean cloths, and a bottle of her strongest whiskey. She was no doctor, but she had seen more gunshot wounds than any doctor in the territory. She worked with a grim competence, cleaning the wound, her face set in concentration. She poured a generous amount of whiskey directly into the raw flesh. Nantan's body went rigid, but he made no sound. He had passed into a state beyond pain, a quiet place of shock and exhaustion. The day bled into a long, strange twilight. The Apache warriors, their purpose served, had melted back into the hills as silently as they had come. Rourke and his men were locked in the town's jail, the same cells that had held Eliza and Nantan, and on the Tucson road, a cloud of dust signaled the return of a very reluctant Judge Miller. He had been met on the road by a delegation of ranchers who had made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that an entire town had witnessed the attempted massacre. His complicity, bought and paid for by Rourke, was now a dangerous liability. He had no choice but to administer the law he had so recently scorned. The trial was held the next day, not in a stuffy courtroom, but in the open air, in the very square where the battle had been fought. The entire town stood as jury and witness, with the testimony of Eliza, of Tommy Hale, and a dozen others who had suffered under Rourke's reign. The verdict was swift and inevitable. Rourke and his inner circle were sentenced to hang Sheriff Greeley, in exchange for his pathetic, whining testimony, was sentenced to life in the federal prison at Yuma. Judge Miller, his reputation in tatters, left town the moment the trial was over, a man fleeing the scene of his own disgrace. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet healing. The summer heat finally broke, and a gentle, steady rain began to fall, washing the blood from the dust and drumming a soft, cleansing rhythm on the tin roofs of the town. The sound was a lullaby, a promise of new growth. Nantan recovered slowly in a back room of Maeve's saloon, with Eliza as his constant nurse. The bullet had shattered his collarbone, a painful and debilitating injury. In the long, quiet hours, they talked, not of the violence of the past, but of the possibilities of the future, the barriers between them. The invisible walls of race and culture had been washed away by shared experience, by blood and trust and the intimacy of the hidden spring. The town was changing, too, with Rourke's corrupting influence gone. The better nature of its people began to surface. The first, most crucial test was the question of water. The long drought had frayed tempers and created enemies of neighbors. Now, with a common enemy vanquished, they had to learn to live with each other. Nantan, though still weak, asked Eliza to arrange a meeting at a long table set up in the livery stable. The town's ranchers, led by Elias Thorne, sat down across from the elders of Nantan's Kurikawa band. It was a tense and awkward gathering at first, the air thick with generations of mistrust. Nantan, his arm in a sling, sat at the head of the table, not as a leader of either side, but as a bridge between them. He spoke, his voice quiet but firm, of the water as the lifeblood of all people, a gift from the earth that could not be owned, only shared. The elders spoke of the sacred springs, of the ancient pathways their people had followed for centuries. The ranchers spoke of their herds, of their families, of their desperate need to survive. Eliza watched, listening to the slow, difficult conversation. She realized that justice was not a single, dramatic event like a trial. It was a process, a series of small, hard choices, a constant, patient negotiation between the needs of people. Finally, Elias Thorne, the crusty, stubborn old rancher, stood up. He looked at the Apache elder across from him, a man whose face was a testament to a long and difficult life. "We have been fools," Thorne said, his voice rough with emotion. "We fought each other for the scraps while a wolf was stealing the whole herd. There is enough water for all of us, if we are wise." The elder nodded slowly. "Wisdom is a heavy stone to carry," he said. "It is good you have decided to help us lift it." An agreement was reached, not on paper, but in a series of handshakes and solemn promises. New routes to the water would be established, respecting the boundaries of the Apache lands. In times of drought, the water would be shared, its use governed by need, not by force. As a symbol of this new pact, the elder's wife came forward and gave a small leather pouch to Thorne's wife. It was filled with seeds of blue corn, a promise of a shared harvest, a shared future. Eliza, too, found a new purpose. She was no longer the outcast. She was the woman who had spoken the truth when no one else would. The town council, now led by Abernathy, offered her the old teaching position back. She refused. "The old schoolhouse is too small," she said. "It holds too many old ideas." Instead, with lumber donated by the ranchers and labor from the townsfolk, they built a new building at the edge of town, a simple, open structure with wide windows that looked out toward the mountains. It was a school not just for the children of the town, but for any child who wished to learn. A few weeks later, the first Apache children, shy and curious, came down from the hills to sit beside the sons and daughters of the people who had once been their enemies. Eliza stood before them, her heart full. She was not just teaching reading and arithmetic. She was teaching them a new language, the language of peace. Nantan, his shoulder healing into a network of scars, became the embodiment of the new agreement. He was the official mediator, the keeper of the trails between the town and his people, a guide who understood both worlds. The suspicion had not vanished overnight. There were still those in town who muttered into their beer about savages, and there were those among his people who remembered the broken treaties and looked at the town with distrust. The healing was a slow, fragile thing, and would take a long time. One evening, as the summer rain drummed its soft rhythm on the new tin roof of the schoolhouse, Eliza and Nantan stood in the doorway, watching the parched earth drink in the life-giving water. The air was clean and cool, washed free of dust and bitterness. He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and strong, hers small but no longer trembling. They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the rain. A man and a woman who had walked through the fire and found each other on the other side. The future was unwritten, a trail leading into an unknown country. But, for the first time, it felt like a trail they could walk together, without fear. The seasons turned. The fierce white heat of summer mellowed into the gold and amber of a high desert autumn. The air grew crisp in the mornings, and the nights carried a clean, sharp chill that spoke of distant snow on the highest peaks. The land, like the people who lived on it, seemed to be taking a long, slow breath, the violence of the noon shootout fading into a scar, a memory that was now part of its story. They walked up the long, sloping side of the hill, the one that overlooked the town from the east. They did not need a horse anymore. Nantan's stride was even and strong, the limp completely gone, though Eliza knew that in the cold, damp mornings. The ache in his leg and shoulder returned, a quiet reminder of the price they had paid. She walked beside him, her hand in his, a simple, comfortable gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The silence between them was easy, filled not with the need to speak, but with the quiet hum of a shared existence. From the top of the hill, the world spread out before them. They could see the town of San Miguel nestled in the valley, no longer a place of menace, but a community in the slow, arduous process of becoming something new. Smoke rose from the blacksmith's forge and the chimneys of the small houses, thin white plumes against a sky of impossible blue. The new schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, its unpainted pine glowing warmly in the afternoon sun. But their eyes were drawn to the great curving line that cut through the landscape to the south, the railroad. The new tracks gleamed, a river of steel, but the river had been diverted. It now swung in a wide, graceful arc, skirting the low, sacred hills that held the bones of Nantan's ancestors. It was a line of progress. Yes, but a progress that had been forced to learn the meaning of respect. It was a compromise etched into the face of the earth, a testament to the fact that one man's greed did not have the right to erase a people's history. They stood there for a long time, looking at the two cemeteries. The one on the hill where they had been ambushed was a place of ghosts and violence, a scar on their memory. But across the valley, the Apache burial ground was a place of peace, its sanctity preserved, its silence unbroken by the shriek of a locomotive. The price had been high, paid in blood and fear, but the ground remained whole. "The past is always with us," Eliza said softly, her voice carrying on the cool breeze. "It does not go away." Nantan squeezed her hand. "It is not a thing to be erased," he said. "It is the earth we stand on. We do not forget the ones who came before. We learn from their tracks, so we can make our own." He looked down at the town. The people there are learning a new path, too, but the old trails are still in their minds. The fear is a deep canyon. It will take many seasons to fill. He was right. The peace was real, but it was fragile. The water treaty held, the shared harvests had been good, but old hatreds died slowly. There were still whispers, still sideways glances when an Apache family came to the general store, and among his own people, there were young warriors who saw the treaty as a weakness, who remembered the old ways of war and saw compromise as a form of surrender. The work was not over. The labor of building a lasting peace, they had learned, was a daily, unending task. It was a kind of love, a choice made over and over again. Their own love was like that. It had not been born in a quiet garden, but forged in a crucible of fear and violence. It did not erase their differences or the worlds they had come from. Eliza would always carry the memory of her husband, the quiet grief for the life she had lost. Nantan would always carry the weight of his people's history, the ghost of his murdered brother a shadow in his heart. Their love was not a forgetting, but a deliberate and courageous choosing. It was the choice to build a new shelter, together, large enough to hold all the pieces of who they were. "You have made me brave," she said, turning to look at him. "I was a woman who lived in a world of books and rules. You taught me that the world is much larger, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. And you," he said, his dark eyes soft, "have taught me a new song. I knew only the songs of survival, of fighting to hold on to what was ours. You taught me the song of building something new, a song that different voices can sing together." They had carried 4 long, sharpened wooden stakes with them, and a heavy mallet from Abernathy's shop. Now, they began to pace out a large square on the flat, grassy top of the hill. It was a place with a view of the town on one side and the vast, open desert on the other. This was to be their next classroom. The schoolhouse in town was for reading, for sums, for the knowledge of the white world. But up here, under the vast, open sky, Eliza wanted a place for a different kind of learning. A place where the Apache children could teach the town children the names of the plants and the stories of the stars. A place where the town children could read their books aloud, their words carried on the same wind that had shaped the canyons. a place where the only walls were the mountains and the only roof was the sky. Nantan held the first stake, its point pressed against the earth. Eliza swung the mallet, the impact a solid, satisfying thud. The sound was a declaration, an act of creation. They took turns, driving each stake deep into the ground, marking the corners of their open-air classroom. It was a claim, not of ownership, but of shared purpose. When they were done, they stood in the center of the marked square. This small patch of earth felt more like a home than any building with 4 walls ever could. It was a promise, a commitment to a future they would have to build one lesson at a time. High above them, a lone crow circled on a thermal, its wings black against the brilliant blue. It made a single, clear call, its voice a wild and lonely sound that was not lonely at all, but full of a fierce, unyielding freedom. Nantan watched it, a faint smile touching his lips. It was a greeting, a reminder of who he was, and a blessing on what they were doing. He put his arm around Eliza, and she leaned her head against his healed shoulder. They looked down at the path that led back to town. It was a simple dirt track, a line of connection, not division. There was no barbed wire here. There were no fences to keep people in or out. It was just a road, a path that a person could choose to walk, or not. Freedom, she thought, was not the absence of boundaries, but the right to choose your own path, and the person you wanted to walk it with. Justice had not come from a man in a black robe or from a tarnished tin star. It had come from the hands of ordinary people, from a blacksmith's shotgun and a deputy's courage, from a woman's testimony and a warrior's wisdom. It had a price, and they would all carry the scars. But standing here, on this quiet hill, looking toward a future they were building with their own hands, she knew without a single doubt that it had been worth paying. They turned and began to walk down the path together, their shadows long behind them in the golden afternoon light, leaving the 4 stakes on the hilltop to stand guard over a promise. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.